Good morning. It's good to see all of you here this morning. We are studying in our Bible class in the book of Revelation, and we've been going through introductory material so far. And we didn't have class last week because we had a guest speaker who was here. Chad Wagner was here talking about the mission work that we support in Africa, and so he had a presentation on that during our Bible class. So it's been a couple weeks. But if you weren't here 2 weeks ago, or if you forgot to bring it with you, there were these little sheets that got handed out. If you didn't get one of those, or if you would like one of those, this is the list of Roman emperors. When we talk about the background for the book of Revelation, Michael will come around if you raise your hand and give you one of those. we we can make some more copies. Yeah. He's gonna make some more copies. He's gonna make some more copies. But what's on this list of emperors here is just to kind of give us an idea of the time period where this takes place, where the book of Revelation happens. Because I guess I got going, and several of you told me that I got going pretty fast 2 weeks ago when we went over this. And so I'm going to try to summarize what we talked about, but slow down a little bit. When we talk about the date of the writing isn't really as important as understanding what the time period is that's being addressed in the book. There are some folks who say that the book was written in 69 AD or maybe a little bit before 69 AD, and that the book is talking about Nero being the one who is the beast from the sea. And they'll use that sign of the beast or the mark of the beast, that number 666, and they'll try to take the letters from Nero's name and add up the numerical equivalent of those letters in the Hebrew to total up to 666 and say, well, this is the emperor that the book of Revelation is talking about. I don't think that that's the case. There was persecution that took place under Nero. Nero died in 68. He committed suicide, and he's gone from the scene, I think, when the time period that the book of Revelation is dealing with is talking about someone who, the beast who is and who isn't, right? That he had died, and it looks like he's back again. And the point that I was making a couple weeks ago is that when Domitian comes along, people are going to feel like Nero has been reincarnated, that this is Nero come back again. And so when the book of Revelation talks about the beast that was and was dead and now looks like it's been resurrected, well, that's, I think, in reference to Domitian being one who really ramps up the persecution on the Christians. Under Nero, there was persecution, but it was more localized just in the area of Rome itself. And Nero's the emperor who puts Paul to death. Nero's probably the emperor when Peter dies. And so there's persecution that takes place of Christians under Nero for sure. But that persecution that's going to be ramped up, where uh, the emperor is going to demand to be worshipped, that really comes under Domitian. And so if you look at the sheet, you'll see that there's 5 emperors that are listed there through Nero. And then I've got, I'll wait till Michael gets it passed out so you see what I'm talking about. You got 3 that are kind of usurpers to the throne there: Galba, Otho, and I think it's Vitellius or Vitlius there. And so they are not considered to be like official emperors, if you will, but they are ones that kind of seize power. And you see that you got that 1 year from 68 to 69, where you've got 5 different people that are in charge from Nero, through into Vespasian's reign, the beginning of his reign in 69. And so when you read in Daniel will, in the prophecies, we'll talk about there being 10 horns, but it talks about 3 of them being uprooted, right? And so that's why I've got 6, 7, 8, and then I start over with 6 with Vespasian, because in Daniel's prophecy, he talks about there being 10 emperors or 10 rulers, right? These 10 horns that come from this particular beast. And so that would include Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. But if you uproot those three, then Vespasian becomes number 6, Titus is 7, and Domitian is the 8th. And when we look at Revelation chapter 17, as far as seeing a date for this, as far as the writing goes, I think Revelation 17 gives us our best clue as to when the book was written. Because as I said, there are some folks that think it was written 68, 69, and that it's talking about Nero. The other date that most people have is 96, that it was written in 96 AD. And if you remember a couple of weeks ago, I told you, remember that at the very beginning, book of Revelation is referred to as a book of prophecy. Right? It's apocalypse, it's apocalyptic language. It's using symbols to show us a picture so that we can see what's going on. But it's a book of prophecy, which means it's telling about things that are going to come. It's talking about things that are shortly going to come to pass, not things that shortly have already passed, but things that are shortly going to come to pass, right? And so when we look at Revelation 17, let's begin here in verse 8. He says, "The beast that you saw was and is not, will ascend out of the bottomless, so will ascend out of the bottomless pit." So as the writer's writing this, he's saying, this is going to happen. This is something that's going to take place. Will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. He's going on to destruction. And when you read in Daniel's prophecy, it talks about that horn, that little horn that's going off to perdition or going off to destruction, uses the same language in Daniel chapter 7 as it does here in Revelation chapter 17. It says, "And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is." And that's that idea that when Domitian comes along, they're going to think, oh, this is Nero reincarnated. This is Nero come back to us. He says, here is the mind which has wisdom. So he's going to explain what this is. And when we talk about the symbols that are here, when the book says this is what the symbol means, this is what the symbol means. And so a lot of people will go on TV and they'll talk about, this is talking about end times, or this is talking about Saddam Hussein, or this is talking about Ayatollah Khomeini, or this is talking about, Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin. It says here, here's the mind. So he's going to describe for us what this is. Here's the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And so you've got a beast that has 7 heads. There's 7 mountains that the woman, the harlot, is sitting upon. Well, that's the city of Rome. Rome was a city that was built on 7 hills. And so it describes for us that, okay, this is what we're talking about. When we talk about these heads, these are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. It says there are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition or going to destruction. And so when we look at this, this matches up perfectly with the emperors of Rome, going back to Augustus being the first of those he was Julius Caesar's nephew. And so he's the first. So you've got those 5 through Nero. And so he says, there's one that now is. That would be Vespasian, if we're looking at this correctly and looking at this being talking about the downfall of the Roman Empire here in the book of Revelation. The 6th one would be Vespasian, right? The one who is would be Vespasian, who rules from 69 to 79. And so it looks like the book is written during the reign of Vespasian, probably towards the end of his reign, because he says there's one who now is, but there's another one who's going to come for a short time. Well, look at Titus. Titus is Vespasian's son. He's going to come, he's going to rule for a short time, just for 2 years. And then the 8th one, who is of the 7, right? He's in the line of those 7. The 8th one is Domitian, and he's the one that they need to be concerned about because he's the one that's really going to ramp this up. Yes, Dwayne?
So the good would it do for John to be talking to the Jews of that day about end time things? What benefit would it be for them? None. So it's obviously talking about what they were fixing to face at the time.
Right.
And much of what he was writing in was code, if you will, to Jews because of the emperor worship that was going on now the Jews would obviously be in a lot of trouble if his writings got out to the Romans and him telling them to not worship the emperor.
Right.
So a lot of this is Jewish code that they would have remembered from their Old Testament teaching
Yeah.
that they understood about these numbers and symbols and such things. And so
Yeah.
Dad,
Yeah. Yeah. The symbols that are here, he's either going to explain what they are or they're going to be something from the Old Testament. And I don't remember the exact number because I've slept in the last 2 weeks. But there's 400 and some allusions to the Old Testament in the book of Revelation itself. And so he's writing it in code, and these Jewish Christians, these early Christians, they would understand the code because they would know their Old Testament history. And so they'd be able to decipher those symbols. And what Dwayne says is correct. This has got to mean something to the folks that is being written to, right? He's writing to first century Christians about a problem of persecution that they're going to face. It wouldn't benefit them any to say, well, here's what's going to happen 2,000 years from now. Or here's what's going to, or the Yankees are going to win the pennant in, the 1940s. It wouldn't benefit them at all. It'd be like, well, so what? How does that help us? Right. And so it's got to mean something to them. And the keys are at the very beginning of the book when he says, these are things which are shortly going to come to pass because the time is near. Right. And you pick that up in Revelation 1:1 and in Revelation 1:3. Right. The time is at hand and the time is near, or it's going to take place shortly. It's going to shortly come to pass. And so most of what we see written in the book of Revelation is something that's going to happen to them in their day and age. And the book is a book of victory, right? Don't lose that in all of this. Don't get lost in all the symbolism and all the book is a book of victory, that if you're on Jesus's side, you're going to win. You're going to be victorious, right? Even though the Roman Empire looks like it's undefeatable, God is still the one who's in control. And we'll see that especially in chapter 4 when we see the throne room of God, that God is still in charge of what it is that's going on. And he's going to allow them, he's going to give them power. He's going to allow them to persecute Christians for a while. But there's going to be a point where he says, okay, that's it. Right. Um, and so we're just trying to set the scene of what's being spoken of. So again, it wouldn't make any sense to me for the book to have been written in 96, because why warn them about the one who's coming, who's going to demand emperor worship, right? And that term at the bottom of the page there, Dominus et Deus, Master and God. That's how Domitian demanded to be addressed. He demanded, whether you were speaking to him or whether you were writing to him, whether it was by mouth or by pen, that you had to call him Dominus et Deus. You had to call him Master and God. And so he's demanding that kind of. And as crazy as Nero was, Nero never asked anybody to worship him, right? But Domitian saw himself as being a god and demanded that they worship him. Any comments or questions on these things? The date's not that important as long as you understand what's going on here, that he's talking about the downfall of the Roman Empire. And so Domitian, as I said, he demanded worship. He, more than any other, insisted upon emperor worship. He made threats. He tortured people, persecuted folks that would not go along with that. And so that's where the persecution of Christians empire-wide really gets ramped up, is while Domitian is in power. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, Domitian demanded worship of himself. He said, "Our Lord and God commands that it be done." So he's saying that our Lord and God commands that you worship me as a god. They had a plethora, right, of gods. They had a whole bunch of Roman gods. And so they didn't have a problem with there being many different gods. But here's Christians, and they believe in just one God, right? And they're not going to bow the knee to Caesar. They're not going to bow the knee to any other pagan god. And so that's going to create conflict, because, well, Christians are going to be pretty adamant that no, we're not doing that. We're not bowing down to these other deities. He erected images of himself. He built statues all over the place so that worship to him could be more convenient, right? You wouldn't have to travel very far before you'd find a statue of Domitian, and you could bow down to worship that. The idea that Caesar is Lord, right? That they had to confess that Caesar is Lord. According to Pliny, the historian, he caused entire groups of people to be slaughtered for refusing to worship him. And you can find that in Will Durant's historical writings. He quotes from Pliny in there. It says he had always been coldly severe, but now he slipped into cruelty. He had no check on himself, right? So the Senate can't say, well, we're going to impeach you, right? The Roman Senate didn't have any power over him. He had absolute power and absolute sway. Um, and so conflict is going to be unavoidable between the Roman Empire and Christians. Um, the forms of punishment were many. They could be exiled. They could have all their possessions taken. They could be tortured. They could die. A lot of times they were thrown into the Colosseum to be fed to the lions for entertainment purposes. And so there were a lot of different things that could happen to Christians during this time period. And so, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, Christianity was considered to be an illegal religion in the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire came and they conquered an area, if you already had a religion that was in effect, then that religion would be granted legal status. But any new religion that got started, that would be considered an illegal or illicit religion. And so with Judaism, Judaism was there. And so when the Roman Empire takes over the area of Palestine, Judaism is granted legal status because it's already an established religion. In Christianity, for a while, well, they thought that that was just a sect of the Jews, that that was just a division of the Jews. But once they came to realize, no, these Christians are not Jewish. They're not a sect of the Jews. They're not part of Judaism, that this is something new. Well, now it became an illegal religion. It became an illicit religion. And it's going to be an illegal religion in the Empire of Rome until the Edict of Milan, which I think is in 315 AD, when the Emperor Constantine grants Christianity legal status, makes it a legal religion, and then eventually makes it the religion of the empire. Now it's apostatized and it's been watered down and it's been changed. When we get to the 300s, there are things that Constantine introduces into what the world considers Christianity that wouldn't be what the true Christians would do. I'm speaking a lot. If you have comments or questions, I would entertain any of those. So we just want to have an understanding of what's going on in the world as the book is talking about. So Christians are going to come at odds with Rome, with the Roman citizens, with the Roman government, because they refuse to worship the emperor. And you might wonder, well, why would God allow his people to be persecuted in this way? Why would he allow Christians to be persecuted by the Roman Empire? God created a world where there's free will, and people can decide whether or not they're going to follow God, right. We can make our own decisions. We can make our own choices. God doesn't force us to be followers of his. God doesn't force us to love him, right? God doesn't force us to be obedient to him. And because of that free will, there are some people who are going to do their own thing. And we'll see that Satan's kind of behind all of this, that Satan recruits the Roman Empire to persecute the Christians. They're kind of in league together. And because of man's free will, God allows that to run its course. God's going to allow them to rule, right? Any ruler that comes to power, God's behind that, right? That God rules the nations, he says in Daniel chapter 2, that he's the one so he allows that to happen. He allows them to rule. He allows them to terrorize the Christians because he's just. And it's hard for us maybe to understand, well, what do you mean he's just? It doesn't seem like it's fair that these poor Christians are being persecuted by the Roman, and nobody can fight against the Roman Empire. Who's going to fight against that? He's not going to punish them for what they haven't done yet. Right? For God to say, well, the Roman Empire is going to be terrible to Christians. These emperors are going to be terrible to Christians. I'm not going to allow them to make that choice. I'm going to wipe them out first. God is just. And even though he knows what's going to happen, he's not going to punish them until they've done it. Now, the nation of Rome, the empire of Rome, they're going to sin and they're going to sin and they're going to sin. And you'll see this a little bit in the book of Revelation. You see it in the Old Testament. There's some terminology that he uses that's called winepress terminology. where God will talk about, it's kind of like a nation has a wine press. And a wine press, you would fill the wine press up with grapes. And when it's full of grapes, then you would get in there and you would tread those grapes out and you'd make grape juice or you'd make wine or whatever it is that you're going to make. And the book of the Bible in the Old Testament in some parts talks about these nations having their wine press filling up with the sins that they've committed. And Rome has a wine press. And once that wine press gets full, well, then Jesus is going to get in that wine press and he's going to tread those grapes out. He's going to tread that nation out. There's a passage in the book of Revelation that talks about his robes were red as if he had come from the wine press. He was treading out, and he says, I've been treading out the nations, right? And so he's just, he's not going to punish them for what they haven't done yet. But when they get to a point where it's like, all right, they've gone beyond their limit, right? They've gone beyond, then God's going to get in there and he's going to tread out the wine press, and that's going to be the end of them. And that's what he's talking about in the book of Revelation, that the sins of Rome are going to become so much, right? So much evil that they are going to accomplish that he's going to get in the wine press and he's going to tread them out, and that's going to be the end of Rome. And the Christians who remain faithful unto death, right? That aren't afraid to lose their physical life so that they can preserve their spiritual life, they're going to be the ones that are going to be victorious. And they're the ones that are going to rule with him. To rule means to be in charge, right? And so they're the ones who die physically but maintain their Christianity, maintain their spirituality. They're the ones that are going to rule when Jesus comes to power. Comments or questions on these things? Yes, Jacob.
So Rome and all that stuff. Eventually, I mean, this could be all world today. This could be America today. I mean, eventually the wine press could become full, and the same kind of themes. While this is not talking about us per se, the same kind of themes that run throughout it you could easily take almost a double application. Just look at where we're at today and see that the persecution and victory still holds true for those that keep the faith until the end.
Yeah. While this is talking about, yeah,
like Rome was a two-sided fall.
Right. While this is written about the fall of Rome, the principles that are there, right? That when a nation exceeds its limit of sin, right? And you wonder how many babies do we have to abort before God's going to get in America's wine press and say that's it, that's enough. Perhaps at some point. And so when we look at the downfall of Rome, right, we can maybe see some parallels with our own nation.
Learn from history.
Learn from history, right? Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it, right? Either you fail the course and you got to take it again, or I don't know. But if you don't learn your history, right, you're doomed to repeat it. And so the book of Revelation is going to talk about, yeah, he's going to allow this to happen, but it's going to be a short time period compared to the length of time that we're going to be victorious.
Did some of those Christians that were persecuted, did some of them die?
Oh yeah, a lot of them did.
Okay, so do you ever think why? Are they trying to build?
Because our physical life isn't the most important thing. Our spiritual life is the most important thing. And so yeah, he's going to allow that to happen because things happen in the world, right? Because people have free will. Somebody could, take a gun and murder somebody, right? God allows that to happen. Why? Because that person had free will. But if the person that died was a faithful Christian, well, they're going on to something better.
You know what I always thought when someone is trying to live for God and Christians, live from the heart, I'm thinking that before we became Christian, we were sinful, right? So I'm thinking that I may be wrong, but I'm thinking that, well, maybe we were sinful back then, and there's a consequence when we sin, right? Even though we ask for forgiveness.
Right.
I'm thinking that plays a part in it.
Yeah, there are consequences of sin, and we can be forgiven, right? If let's say I murder somebody, right? Could God forgive me for that if I repent and I say I'm sorry and I come to God? Right, I can be forgiven of that, but there's a consequence of that sin. That person that I killed is still dead, right? That's a consequence. I may have to spend the rest of my life in prison because of it, right? So that's a consequence of sin. So there are consequences, even though we might be able to get forgiveness. There are still consequences of sin that take place.
And I would add too that it's kind of weird. Weird is the right word. It's an odd point, but like some of these folks that got martyred in that early century, it actually helped increase the faith of the others. It was almost an encouragement because they saw other Christians keeping the faith up unto death. Just as Jesus kept every bit of the promises that he came to fulfill it. Some of these early Christians, look, I mean, they celebrate the days. They almost did like anniversary in years past of like
Yeah.
so and so is martyred at this time, and that gives them like an encouragement to just keep fighting. They go,
Yeah.
they looked at it as almost kind of like Paul did, which is almost like a reward. You know, they count it almost joyous that someone would persecute them so much because of the Lord, and they just get to go on and do it sooner rather than later.
Yeah. All those martyrs, right? All those people that died in the first century with regards or second century dealing with this Roman persecution, they were looked at, right, as heroes of the faith. And if they could be faithful to this, if they could go through this, then we can do that too. And when you look at the pages of Scripture, even through the book of Acts, now it's not Roman persecution so much at the beginning; it's Jewish persecution, it's limited Roman persecution during the time of Nero. The church was persecuted in those early years. What happened when they were persecuted? Did they shrivel up and die? Did they just kind of sit in the corner and cry? No, the church multiplied, right? The church grew. They were persecuted, but they continued to grow. The persecution didn't stop them. It may have benefited, because when they were persecuted in Jerusalem, what did they do? They were scattered, which is what Jesus wanted, right? He wanted them to leave Jerusalem and go out to the world, right? They were scattered through the persecution. What did they do? They preached the word everywhere that they went, right? And so they spread Christianity. The persecution actually helped spread Christianity in those early years. And so the same thing. And so when we look at the book of Revelation with regards to the persecution that they're going to face, we talked about Numbers 2 weeks ago as well. When you look at the length of the persecution, he talks about it being 3.5, right? A period of three, whether it's 3.5 days or 3.5 years, but a period of 3.5. Well, what's 3.5? Well, it's an incomplete number. Right? The Roman Empire is not going to be able to wipe out all of the Christians. It's not going to be able to wipe out Christianity, because the time of persecution is an incomplete number. They're not going to be able to finish this, right? It's so 3.5. So you have to endure this persecution for 3.5. Now, sometimes that 3.5 will be listed as, you'll see it as time, singular, times, plural, and half a time. Well, what is that? That's 3.5. Sometimes you'll see the time listed as 42 months. Well, what's 42 months? It's 12 months in a year. 3 years is 36. Half a year is 6 more. 3.5 years is 42 months. What's the average number of days in a month? 30. 42 times 30, if my math is correct, comes out to 1,260. And in Revelation chapter 17, where we were, it says that the woman, right, the church, that she's going to be in the wilderness or protected for 1,260 days.
What verse is this?
Maybe that's not in 17. It's in chapter 12. I'm sorry. The woman who was given, it says in verse 14, the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, and she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. Does anybody have a different translation that says 1,260 days there? Verse 6. Okay, the woman fled into the wilderness where she has a place prepared. They should flee there. Yeah, 1,260 days. And so you'll see this time of persecution. It'll be listed sometimes times, and half a time, sometimes 1,260 days, sometimes 42 months, all talking about the same time period. That it's an incomplete time period in which the persecution is going to take place. But those who are going to live and reign with Christ after we're victorious, Revelation chapter 20 says they're going to reign with him for 1,000 years. And 1,000 is just as a symbolic number, right? 10 is a complete number, and 1,000 is a multiple of 10. It's 10 times 10 times 10. And so it's 3 times complete. And so while the persecution is an incomplete number, it's a short time period that, yeah, you're going to have to deal with this and you may lose your physical life, but the reward lasts for a complete time. It lasts a long time afterwards, right? And so that's the basic message of the book, if you will, is that you're going to have to endure this. You're going to have to go through this. Here's what's going to happen, but stick with it, right? Remain faithful unto death, and you'll receive the crown of life. Stick with it because in the end, we're going to win. And we win by surrendering, right? We win by,
We want to stay here. We can't think. I mean, although we trying to get there, we
yeah.
just want to stay. I guess what they're on. Don't you think?
Well, we're physical beings, right? And we're in a physical place, and we think that, well, this is, we want to stay, we want to preserve our lives as long as we can here on this earth. And that the life that we have is a gift from God, right? So we don't want to diminish that, but what we have waiting for us is so much better than what we have here.
Does that weaken our faith when we think like that? If we're trying to live for God, like we don't believe it, we want to stay here, we don't want to go there. Does that weaken our?
Well, I think we need maybe a better understanding of knowing that what's there is better. Now, that doesn't mean that we live dangerously, right? Jacob talked about, some people would look at these martyrs and say, well, I want to do that. Ignatius of Antioch was one who he courted persecution. He wanted to be killed. He wanted to be martyred. We shouldn't go into it saying, well, I'm going to do everything that I can so that the government will kill me. We ought to go into it saying, I'm going to do everything that the Lord wants me to do. And if the government kills me because I'm doing what the Lord wants me to do, then so be it. Right. But he was one that was like, well, I want to be one of those martyrs. I want to be in that. I want my name in that book. And so Ignatius kind of courted that, where I don't think we ought to court that, but I think we ought to do what the Lord requires and let the chips fall where they may.
Think about kingdoms up perspective. We always put that, if you always show Sodom and store, people in the house, they like belonging to all the time going on. I mean, it's true to a sense it's our temporary, but I mean, it's not really like how much troubles and how to share our life. This is
Well,
temporary tent we get for a little while.
right.
True.
Right. Our true home is there in heaven. When we think of our citizenship as being in heaven first, right? Then we're not going to, we're going to know what's most important to us, right? And rather than thinking about this world being our home and this country being our home, and we got to do everything and spend all of our time on Facebook with regards to politics, because boy, we got to do this, we got to elect this person, we got to save our country. Yeah, that's good. But our ultimate citizenship is in heaven first, and then in the United States. God's not an American, right? God doesn't, he's not a respecter of persons, right? It doesn't matter what nationality you are, right? And so we need to when we think of our citizenship being in heaven first, then it'll line up our priorities in the right order. Where if we tend to think more of, well, America is my home and I got to do everything to make America great. Well, it's good that America's great. It's good that things in the country are, we have freedom to worship and all of that. But we need to remember our ultimate citizenship is there in heaven. Now, as far as understanding the book of Revelation, as I said, there's a lot of symbols from the Old Testament. We'll hearken back to the Old Testament as we go through this a lot. We'll notice where it talks about these things with regards to the government and the symbols with regards to the beast. Going back to the book of Daniel, will show that that's in reference to governmental power, so that it's not just Dale saying, this is in reference to the Roman Empire. The symbols themselves will prove that it's talking about governmental power at the time in which they're living. That they have to deal with. There's two basic there's a basic division of the book, because sometimes when we read the book, because of all the symbols and all the things that are there in the apocalyptic language, it's easy to get lost in it and think, well, it seems like this has already happened once, and now it seems like the same thing is happening over again later on in the book of Revelation. Well, it's talking about the same thing, but it's talking about the same thing in a different way. In chapter 1 through 11, you've got the first division of the book in chapters 1 through 11. And basically in chapters 1 through 11, he's going to talk about the basic struggle in the world between the church and the Roman Empire. Right? So it's a struggle between the church and the world. And so you got that physical struggle that's taking place. And that's what he's talking about in chapters 1 through 11. In chapter 12 through 22, really 12 through, I guess, the first part of chapter 20, because after that he's talking about heaven. But you got the spiritual battle or the spiritual struggle that's taking place between the forces of righteousness and the forces of evil. And so while this struggle is taking place on earth between the church and the world, you've got a higher spiritual battle that's taking place behind the scenes, if you will. And so we're going to get a look at that. And so what he's talking about with regards to things being poured out or trumpets being blown in chapters 1 through 11, then you've got kind of the same thing, the same kind of disaster is happening in chapters 12 through 22. It's not another disaster that's coming. It's talking about the same thing, but now from a spiritual perspective rather than a worldly perspective. And so you'll see that division of the book. For instance, when you look at chapter 5, in chapter 5, you've got this scene, and notice in verses 6 and 7. Because I looked, and behold, in the midst of the throne and of the four living creatures, and in the midst of the elders, stood a lamb as though it had been slain. Well, who is that? That's Jesus, right? That's the lamb who had been slain. That's Jesus who died on the cross and is resurrected and is now right seated at the right hand of the Father. So he's ascended up into heaven. And so there he is in the heavenly scene, is a lamb as though it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. Then he came and took the scroll out of the right hand of him who sat on the throne, right? Jesus ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God, right? He's seated at the right hand of the throne of majesty. And so here you've got Jesus ascended into heaven at the right hand of the Father. That's in chapter 5, right? That's in the first section of the book when we're looking at this worldly conflict. Come over to chapter 12. And chapter 12 is talking about a woman who's ready to give birth. That represents the Judaism. It represents the nation of Israel, if you will. Notice in verse 5 of chapter 12, she bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was called up to God and his throne. Well, who is that was born that was going to rule all the nations with a rod of iron? That's Jesus, right? And what happened to Jesus? He was caught up to God and his throne, right? So it's talking about the same event. So not that he ascended into heaven twice, but he ascended into heaven, and we see where that is as far as a timestamp goes in Revelation 5 and verse 7. We see it here in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 5 that it's a timestamp. Here's when Jesus ascends into heaven. And so you see that the dual telling of the same things, but one from a worldly perspective and one from a spiritual perspective. And so you can maybe mark that division in there so that it'll help you maybe understand when we get to that. Comments or questions on these things? Anything that I went over too fast where I lost you this time? As I said, the very beginning of the book is important because it tells us that this isn't gonna take a long time for most of the things that are in the book to happen. In the first 3 verses, it says, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. And he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John, who bore witness of the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ, to all things that he saw. Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near." And so notice there twice, right? He says in verse 1 that these things must shortly take place. And he says in verse 3 that the time is near.
They've been talking about the time is near for a long, long, long time. So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, he's saying that the time is near, right? And when you go to the end of the book in Revelation chapter 22, John is told not to seal up the words of this prophecy. Notice in Revelation 22 and verse 10, he said to me, do not seal the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is at hand. So he says, don't seal this up because it's going to happen shortly. It's going to shortly come to place, right? The time is at hand. If the time's at hand and it's near, it's ready to happen. And so it can't be talking about things that are 1,000 years in the future. It can't be talking about things that are 2,000 years in the future. So it's not talking about things in our future. It's talking about things in our past that happened, because it's got to mean something to those folks that it's written to, right? And what would it mean to those folks that it's written to 2,000 years ago if we're talking about things that haven't happened yet? Wouldn't mean anything to them. Yes, sir.
A lot of today's Christianity looks to Revelation as end time things, but nobody talks about Second Thessalonians chapter 2 and the lawless man.
Yeah.
And you read about the lawless man, it's all speculation, but the best we can figure is that's what really end of time is going to look like. That's a difficult subject and you
Yeah.
put your finger on it, but that's certainly a little more descriptive of the end of time thing than what Revelation's talking about.
Yeah. There's some end of time stuff with Revelation, but it's when you get into chapters 20, 21, and 22, where it's talking about judgment day and heaven. So that is in the future, right? Because judgment day hasn't happened yet. We're not all in heaven yet, right? So or Hades or hell. So that hasn't happened yet. But the main part of the book of Revelation are things that are going to happen in their time period. Because he says, don't seal the book. In the Daniel's prophecy, Daniel is told, seal this up because it's a long ways off. Daniel's writing around 550, 540 BC, and he's writing about things that are going to take place in 146, 145 BC. So he's writing about things that are going to happen 400 years in the future. And God says, seal it up because it's not for your generation, it's for the future, right? So seal it up because the time is a long way off, and that long way off was 400 years. Here he says, don't seal it up because the time is at hand. So it can't be about things that are 1,000 or 2,000 years in the future, because he says, seal it up. It's 400 years in the future. It's not for your generation. But here he says, don't seal this up because the time is at hand. It is for this generation of people that they need to know about this. And if you get nothing else from the book of Revelation, if you understand that, then you'll be able to know that when these people get on TV and they start talking about, oh, this sign in the book of Revelation, here's what's happening now, and they'll pull out the newspaper and say, this is what's happening in our world. That's not what the book of Revelation is talking about, because these things must shortly come to pass in their time frame. Any last minute comments, questions, or snide remarks before we break for worship? Or you can save the snide remarks for Wednesday, but Jacob never entertains them. Thank you. I appreciate your attention and comments.